That's right. The Call of the Netherdeep is here. Critical Role's adventure that takes place in their world of Exandria. We are going to be taking a look at this book to figure out if it is worth your money to buy and your time to run. I know that your time is valuable, so I'm going to get through this as quickly as I can. This adventure is optimized for a party of 5, though it can be adjusted accordingly. I didn't notice any rules or guidance for adjusting encounters, but it might be hidden in there somewhere. The adventure starts out at level 3 and goes all the way to level 12. If you want to start out at level 1, the book recommends running one of their adventures from the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount called Unwelcome Spirits. There are 7 chapters in this book. I expect it'll take around 50 to 60 hours to run, but of course that can vary widely depending on your group. In this adventure, you will visit 5 different locations. 3 of them are fully fleshed out towns/cities. The 2 other locations, one is the Sunken City, which is basically underwater ruins, and then the other is another realm, which is the Netherdeep. So quick overview of the chapters and kind of the flow of the adventure. You start out in Jigao, a town in Jorhas. While in Jigao, they have a festival going on. The players can compete in some of the different games and activities at the festival and earn medals of merit. I'll go into those later in my items section. Then the second section is basically an underwater dungeon crawl. It's not too challenging and there isn't too much going on with it, but it is still pretty fun and you're racing your rivals to get to the end of it. Chapter 2 is traveling from Jigao to Bazazon. Only about half of the random encounters are combat, which is kind of nice to mix it up. They don't all have to be bad. Then moving on to chapter 3, once they arrive in Bazazon, there's a couple little fights, but it's mostly going to be exploring the city, social encounters, things like that. The second section of chapter 3 is a dungeon crawl. This one is not underwater and is a bit more deadly and far more interesting in my opinion. Once they finish with the dungeon crawl in chapter 3, they will go to Ank'Harel, which takes us to chapter 4 and out of Jorhas and into the continent of Marquette. When they arrive in Ank'Harel, they will join one of 3 factions. Once they join a faction, there will be 6 faction missions. These missions will take them into chapter 5, which is the Sunken City. The Sunken City functions pretty much like a dungeon crawl, and a lot of that is underwater. While diving through the Sunken City, they will find the portal to the Netherdeep. Once they get into the Netherdeep, this takes us to chapter 6, which is entirely an underwater dungeon crawl. There are some new creatures that are here, some interesting combat encounters, but it is primarily traps and puzzles and hazards and things like that. The combat encounters do get better from this point on, and there's some pretty interesting creatures that they will find in the Netherdeep. Then chapter 7 is just the fight with the big bad boss. An entire chapter dedicated to the final fight makes sense when you know all of the pieces that kind of go into it. There's 3 stages to the fight, is you have to kill the big bad guy multiple times and in different forms. There's also 3 potential endings, and so the choices that the players make matter, which is something that's really cool and I really appreciate in this. All right, so now taking a look at kind of the balance of play here, this is what I expect it will look like for most tables. 40% social encounters. This is because in each of the cities, there are a lot of NPCs that are interesting that the players might want to talk to, but a lot of it can be cut out as most of them are not essential. They're not forced. There are a lot of optional kind of dialogue and conversations to have. Next is exploration. I count puzzles, traps, hazards, in the exploration, which is why this is so high, is because there are a surprising amount of dungeon crawls in this campaign. I was not expecting this many, and they did a really good job with it. The traps and hazards and all of that are very visual, very cinematic, and interesting to run, and I believe that the players will have a good time solving them and going through them. Last is combat. If you're wanting a super combat heavy campaign, you'll have to make some adjustments as the dungeon master, or maybe a different campaign would be a better option. There weren't too many combat encounters. It's not that there isn't any. Every chapter has a couple combat encounters, and they weren't that interesting until you get more into the Netherdeep and some of the later chapters. but it's still pretty good. It's meh, it's okay. Though it would be pretty easy to fit some more combat encounters into this or adjust some of them to make them a little more interesting. All right, next up are some of the mechanics that this adventure introduces. They had talked a bit beforehand about some new underwater mechanics. Honestly, this was a little bit disappointing. All they added were some rules for how long you can swim before rolling for exhaustion, some underwater visibility guidance, and some rules for water pressure for when you're really deep down, which comes into play in the Netherdeep. That was literally it. That is all they added for underwater. Something they added that I did think was really cool were the rivals, and the way that they do that is a really good framework for how to run rivals, and they do it in a very easy to read and digestible way where all of the information and prompts are very short, concise. You understand a brief history of each of the rivals, what their goals and motivations are, and then how they'll react based on the relationship to the party, whether that's friendly, neutral, or hostile. They also have these fragments of sorrow that I thought were pretty cool. They're not a huge part of the game, but they did give me some inspiration that I'm going to be including into the campaign that I'm prepping right now. The fragments of sorrow give some benefits and drawbacks, and the way they do it is just pretty cool. I liked that. They also have Ruidium, which is a magical substance that infuses with items and weapons and makes them magical and stronger, but there's also some drawbacks to it because they can corrupt the user, and the way that they handle this is really cool, and the corruption adds mental effects and physical effects, and even when you get rid of some of the levels of exhaustion, which is how they gauge that, it doesn't get rid of the physical effects. With Ruidium though, exhaustion plays a much bigger part in this campaign than it does in probably some of the other ones, especially with some of the swimming rules as well. Next are magic items that they include. There are a total of 15 new magic items, though 7 of them are medals of merit, which you get in the first chapter. These medals of merit are one-time use items, which is nice because they're not overly strong, and with them being one-time use items, you can give them out as freely as hitting the like button without worrying about breaking your campaign. With the items, 7 of them can help enhance combat by either giving a bonus to damage, AC, or health, and the rest are mostly utility, such as breathing underwater, teleportation, things like that. There are 22 new creatures, though 9 of them are humanoids. Of the other 13 monsters, we have 7 aberrations, 2 undead, 2 monstrosities, and 2 beasts. There are 4 modded creatures. 3 of the modded ones are the Obelith, the Wraith Warrior, and Wraith Commander. Those are very similar to the original ones. Then there is the Corrupted Giant Shark, which has some new features. The average CR of the creatures are 6. They have all the way from a CR1 up to a CR12. My favorite creature, it is the Light Devourer. I think that cinematically, this could be really interesting to run, and I'm looking forward to throwing this creature at my players. So some things that this adventure does right. There are maps for all of the cities, dungeons, locations, which I love. I really appreciate. I like being able to use maps. Even if I don't give it to my players, at least I have something to go off of when they're going through some of this. So thumbs up there. There's a lot of water activities in this campaign. A lot of it takes place underwater, which is really cool for those players that like to run underwater races. They also give tools so that if you don't want to run an underwater race, you're not screwed. You still have tools to be able to breathe underwater and swim and things like that. So I think they did a really good job with that, which makes this adventure a lot more appealing to DMs that want to run somewhat of an underwater adventure, or at least get inspiration for their underwater adventure. Another thing they did right is the social encounters are not forced. They have a lot of optional social encounters. This is a really good thing. I enjoy them not being forced because I think me specifically, my players role play and socialize a lot better when it kind of feels up to them. There's something interesting or an NPC that seems interesting, but it's their choice to go talk to them. It's not forced. This also means that the amount of social encounters and role playing can vary greatly depending on the table. A lot of it can be cut out for players that don't want to role play and talk to NPCs a lot. A huge thing that I really like about this campaign is that the decisions matter. The way that your players treat the rivals and the decisions they make at the end, they are all impactful and will change the experience, which is kind of the point of playing D&D. Lastly, they included a pronunciation guide, which I really appreciate because sometimes I like to know how to pronounce things correctly. All right, so should you buy this? Is it for you? I don't think it's necessary to buy. They didn't include any new races, subclasses, anything like that, so players aren't going to be asking for races or tools out of this. So if you buy it, it's probably just because you want to run it or you want to pull some inspiration out of it. I do think that it is a good adventure, and while reading through it, there were a lot of things that I was able to pull inspiration from that I'm going to be including in my game, but it's not necessary. This one's really just up to you if it sounds interesting to you based on everything I've discussed. If there's anything you want to know about in more detail or an individual chapter breakdown and recommendations for how to run it, I'd be happy to do that. Let me know if that's something that sounds interesting to you. Thank you all, and I'll see you next time.